All right, we're going to jump into Chapter 7. And Chapter 7 is just going to be talking about language and learning disabilities associated with ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Our goals, every time I include these are always included at the beginning of your chapter. This time the goals are explain the difficulties in defining learning disabilities with ADHD, identifying the major language difficulties that are often experienced by students who have ADHD, and then of course identifying the appropriate instructional approaches for these students who have ADHD combined with the language learning disability. Key terms in this chapter: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disability, dyslexia, metalinguistic skills, word finding, the Orton-Gillingham method, speech recognition, technology, and then strategy training. I encourage you, if after our lecture today and after reading you don't understand any of those key terms, that you seek me out so we can make sure you have those down. First, I want to just have you try a little something, a little learning disability simulation, if you will. I want you to choose one of these directions on the right-hand side. You can try writing a sentence with your non-dominant hand to see what it might feel like to have a fine or gross motor disability. You could hold a mirror over your paper and try and write, but looking in the mirror to where things would look reversed to simulate what it might feel like to write if you had dyslexia. Or you could try reading a text message in reverse order, starting with the last letter, so sounding it out, going backwards to again simulate maybe someone with a reading disability. We always want to attempt to try our best to come from a place of understanding, even though if we are not learning disabled, we cannot completely understand what these individuals are going through. So we're going to start with looking at learning disabilities and language, and then we'll move into ADHD and language. We're going to read this case study, and while I'm reading, I just want you to be looking at what characteristics might suggest that this person has a learning disability. Keisha is an 8-year-old African-American student in a regular second grade class. Her teacher is concerned about her lack of progress in reading and her poor socialization. The teacher also reports that Keisha is pleasant and cooperative, but is very shy and reluctant to participate in groups. She is reading at an early first grade level, and her reading is slow and hesitant. Her first grade teacher noticed similar problems with reading and socialization, but hoped that the child would outgrow these problems. Mrs. W. has struggled to provide for Keisha and her 2 brothers since her husband left her. Mrs. W. has held a succession of low-paying jobs and has been unemployed several times. The family lives in public housing in a high-crime neighborhood. Mrs. W. has reported that Keisha's early development was normal, but she remembers that Keisha had frequent colds and earaches and was always a quiet child. Keisha was observed in the classroom during a group reading lesson and during group work on a writing assignment that followed the reading lesson. When called on to read, she read very quietly. She hesitated frequently and misread a number of words. She needed a great deal of assistance to complete a paragraph. However, when asked a question about the passage, she responded correctly. During the group activity, Keisha kept to herself. She joined in only when prompted to do so by her teacher. Keisha was tested for possible classification for special educational services. Her WISC scores in the major cognitive areas clustered within the average range. Within the verbal area, her results varied from the 6 to the 9-year-old levels. The TOLD, which is a very common language test, was administered and yielded a spoken language quotient of 84, which would be in the just below the average range. Her test profiling indicated that her lowest scores were in word articulation and word discrimination, which are elements of phonology. Keisha scored highest in grammatical understanding and picture vocabulary. So as you're looking at this, some things that may suggest she have a learning disability. It says she has difficulty reading words, her reluctance to talk, And those results from her language testing might cause you to think, is something else going on, even though it was slightly below average is pretty close. And so then you're like, if she knows that, then why isn't she using it, kind of thing. And that reluctance to talk or read aloud, there's different reasons. Some kids really are just shy, but some kids are not shy. There's something else going on. The fact, though, that her intelligence tests, that would be like the WISC score, or her academic testing rather, and her language skills are kind of both average. There's not one that's higher or lower than the other. They're both in the average range. But then why is she reading on a lower level? So there's just still some questions. Something isn't quite right. And so that's why they're starting to dig in with these tests. But I would hope that if you had a student like this, you would be looking at them closer too. A few areas these kids might be identified in eventually would be as learning disabled, a speech or language impairment potentially, or a specific language impairment. And we have to remember that we can only qualify kids when their academics is affected, when we can show that their educational performance is affected as a result of this disability, a learning disability, a speech or language impairment, or a specific language impairment, which are different. A learning disability are what I think all already probably know, just any difficulties in thinking, listening, speaking, reading, spelling, or math. It's pretty broad. Speech language difficulty, they're usually apparent in early development, and they definitely impact learning. And then a significant language difficulty is usually also identified at an early age, but it's a language deficit, but it's without accompanying factors. So it's like a pure language disability. A lot of times a language disorder is a secondary disorder to another disability, maybe like cerebral palsy or autism or something like that. But it's saying this is a specific language impairment without any other accompanying factors of hearing loss or low IQ or neurological damage, etc., etc. Next, we're going to start going through all the areas where we see there's some evidence for language learning disabilities in conjunction with students who might have a reading or learning disability. And we're going to go through it according to category, like I had told you when we first got started. So first, looking at phonology. There's research that shows that good readers have good phonological skills, whereas poor readers have poorer phonological skills. And those phonological skills specifically would be dividing words into syllables or counting syllables, identifying sounds, segmenting phonemes, so being able to pull apart the k, at from the word cat, and rhyming. And that's why you're going to see these things are often happening in early childhood classrooms, as they should, because they're a good indicator of reading success. Next, we'll look at the area of morphology. And this is what really helps children analyze and understand complex words, is their ability to understand things in their smallest parts. And so kids who have trouble with morphology have difficulty with vocabulary, with word reading, with spelling, and reading comprehension. So we can see how these children that have these academic disabilities, it's rooted in a language issue. And dyslexia, so that's a very common thing, and it's becoming more and more prevalently diagnosed, And studies show that poor morphological awareness is associated with reading disorders in more than one language, so not even in just English. And there's a greater correlation to morphological awareness to native English speakers or English language learners. Next would be syntax, which is also meaning grammar. They often have difficulty understanding syntactic structures like complex sentences. These individuals are going to use shorter and less complex utterances when they speak. So we have a hard time receptively understanding and expressively just in how they talk, you'll notice. And there will be grammatical errors in their writing, which I think is what we often think of, or even like their speaking, but even in oral reading. So they could have the right grammatical structure in front of them, but they're going to read it how they would say it. And so that's a major indicator that something's up. If they can decode okay, but when they're reading out loud, they're reading it with poor grammar. In the area of semantics or just vocabulary, they're going to have a difficult time with word finding, so they might take longer to retrieve words from their memory. And you need that not only to speak, but to understand. They're going to have a hard time with just the amount of vocabulary, the amount of definitions they know, and you need that for expressive and receptive language. And then they're going to struggle with non-literal language, which reflects rigidity many students have that have disabilities. And so that just comes from their difficulty in how much their brain can hold and associate with different vocabulary words. Like if they can't even do it with its original meaning, if that's difficult, it's going to be even more difficult to use non-literally. And so we know that that's needed for expressive and receptive language. And so we often see that language deficit in many disabilities, including learning disabilities. Next, I'm going to play a video for you before we look at the area of pragmatics or social skills.